Welcome to this week's lecture on the artist as a researcher. Last week, we looked at process and how you can learn through this idea of process making. And then this week, we're going to focus on a different part of, I guess, a key aspect of being an artist, which is research and how the research can really inform your work. So to show you how that works within a practice, I'm going to look at my practice for you today and really sort of, I guess, make clear how research is really vital for me as an artist and how I really use research within my practice as a key component. So last week, I put this slide up, as well as Martin put it up at the start of trimester, the first week. So I just want to remind you about this process you're doing, especially with your tasks. You're composing, you're reflecting, recomposing. So you're making work, you're looking at, reflecting, thinking about it, and then based on those evaluations or those findings you do from reflecting, you go and make recomposed or work that is slightly different or continues in this way, or work that is informed by previous work you're making. So you're constantly doing this cyclic process of composing, reflecting, and recomposing. So I think why I wanted to show you my practice today was because I feel like looking at a wider breadth of an artist's practice can really show you how this compose, reflect, recompose really does exist within the way artists work and artists make things. So I wanted to just put this up as a reminder of that. And this sits along this like deep research-led inquiry and drive there. So this came from a German online arts article. So if you're interested in it, you can look up the details and you can find the link. The link looks a bit dodgy otherwise, but that's because it's sort of this trendy German arts weird web link. So here I think this is a really good example of the making and the reflection. So the exceptional thing about research in and through art is the practical action, the making, and theoretical reflection, the thinking, go hand in hand. The one cannot exist without the other in the same way action and thought are intrinsically linked in artistic practice. So you are going to be making your work and you're going to be reflecting and thinking about it just naturally. And the one thing that's quite different about it doing it in an academic context is you're putting that on paper and you're trying to become much more aware of that reflection, that thought process that you're doing when you're making as an artist. So here you're getting taught to be aware of it, and outside it's just a natural process artists are doing. It's just we want you to be more aware of it and benefit of it in the best of your ability. This cyclic process of making, reflecting, then remaking. So in this vein, I'm going to show you some work I produced in undergrad. It's not the highest quality image, but I just thought I would put it here, just give you a brief description. In my third year undergraduate work, I made this series about my family and myself and how I felt we belonged in society or how we fit in, and the cultural stereotypes or expectations pushed on us from either way, in either end. And this included images of my family members, one of my brothers, and my mother in the work. So I just want to show you this because as artists work, you can find they have threads in their practice or their threads of working. So I painted and I drew onto the photographs in the sense like tiny little circles over the body, white paint, ink, different methods of actually working on top of the photograph. So from there, I had this specific work I wanted to make. So I went to India, I got a grant, and I did some training in Indian miniature painting. Short amount, like not enough to be a master, but I didn't have any painting experience, and I thought this is something for me. I wanted to make particular work, and painting, Indian miniature painting, seemed really helpful in my mind to that. So at the same time, I was thinking about inheritance, like inherited trauma or what you get passed down, inherited expectations. So I did this animation working with this process of miniature painting, but in a very abstract stop animation sense. So this is the first time, like, I also collaborated with my brother to produce the sound design on this work. And it was shown at UQ Art Museum. But I kind of was trying to find pictures of the women in my family. It was actually very hard to find anything from my grandma back. So I got one picture of my grandmother, and that was sort of it, and my mother. And at this time as well, I went to India with my mother, and we photographed this work, sort of playing this idea about like expectations, and as outsiders, not from there, but being connected to their expectations passed on us. So I sort of continue with this process of working on the photographic print in here in this sort of miniature style that I'm attempting, which I had just sort of first learnt. But one of the things is around this time, my mother was doing some research of her own, and she was trying to sort of prove her Indianness for an overseas citizen of India document, so she could go to India anytime without a visa. And what she was able to sort of find was that she didn't have a birth certificate, but her brother had a birth certificate, and it listed these numbers against the birth certificate, and these numbers connected to the ship list. And this is a history we knew about, but we didn't really sort of talk about a lot. And from these ship lists, we were able to find like what villages sort of. So we did, Mum and I, in these works, we did go to the areas that some of our ancestors would have been from and come from. But it got me sort of thinking more about this. So this ship list is a list of names written by the British when they took people from India to work as labourers, and in this case, indentured labourers. And so for me, pieces were coming together with these different things I was thinking about in terms of what you have passed down to you generationally, as well as trying to understand this thing that I knew about. What we sort of like, it was becoming more of a conversation with my mother and I, and my mum had started this research, which I have been continuing actually. So basically, after the abolition of slavery, colonies, and particularly the British, needed cheap labour. So what they did was they took people that they considered British subjects, and they took them to work in their colonies, in other colonies from other colonies. So they took them to work as cheap labour, and the methods of bringing these people over was not necessarily altogether clear. So tricking, coercion, kidnapping, different aspects like that. So approximately 1.5 million Indians were taken by force or through false promises across the Indian, Atlantic and Pacific Oceans to work as indentured labourers on mostly sugar plantations. So you can see Fiji is listed here. The Queensland almost took Indians as well, but decided they were too expensive, so instead they took South Sea Islander peoples. So that's another history here we have in Queensland of South Sea Islander peoples being taken to work with awful conditions, and only recognition now. So I think yesterday or the day before was actually South Sea Islander Recognition Day. So I just wanted to acknowledge that as well. And the history of slavery and the history of bonded labour on this land and this place as well. So my family were taken from Inuit to Natal, South Africa. So that's what I was trying to understand and trying to explore, because I guess I was trying to think about my family and what information I knew and trying to uncover who were these people on this list, and what were their stories. So here you have people given numbers. So these are the numbers that, here are the numbers that people sort of given as identification. So they had these numbers on passes, and they a lot of them didn't sign things. So they their form of agreeing to the contract, which they couldn't read or understand either, was a thumbprint. So and this is just some of the images I was looking at in terms of this research, trying to understand what happened and thinking about how could I respond to this history in a way that seemed right. So in conventional history of indenture, there has been gaps and silences. These unconventional sources, by focusing on the subjective experience of the indentured people and taking into account their memories and voices, fill these gaps in some respects. So I was finding it really hard to find information. Everything was written from a colonial voice. So if you read information, if you find things, if you look at images, the writing was from plantation owners or the colonial government, not really at all from these voices. And if it was, how accurate was that reiteration? Especially, there's multiple languages, there's all these things which stops them being heard in these spaces. And how do we find their voices when time has shifted and changed? And I was also struggling in a personal way with my mother, trying to discover who are these people and what information can I find. And it's not like being biracial. I have one side of my family which is Anglo-Celtic, and I can find that information on ancestry.com like that. Whereas this side, it's very hard to find anything at all, even very, very close. And the systems, with apartheid as well, make it very difficult. So this idea of gaps and silences was very much speaking to me, and I was feeling a great sense of loss at that time. And so I took my mother back to South Africa, to Durban, after 30 years. She hadn't been there back since apartheid. And this was this process of trying to uncover these gaps and trying to speak to the old people who could tell us more information. But this realization that people who knew things have passed away. So how do you find this? And the information that I did find accessible there, I had, and it's about how do I get different access. So as you can see I was looking at a lot of photographs I could find in different ways. But again, this quote from Anna Arabinden Kesson, photographs just provide a fragmentary record. So it's the photograph is just showing a representation. We've talked about this, the photograph is truth or not. And especially if you haven't watched that lecture on representation from last trimester, I do recommend it. It's available on the YouTube account. But in terms of showing a biased version of something or showing one side of something, the photograph does not tell everything, and it's not necessarily speaking on behalf of the people who were indentured and the horrendous experiences they had. So I was thinking about the women who came before me, what they would have experienced in terms of being in this situation, but also how, in my mind, and seeing what happened to all of them, they had these awful paralleling experiences, and this understanding of trauma being passed down generationally, and thinking about healing and thinking about sort of my mother and this relationship. So I made this video work here about it, where I did work with my brother developing this sound, work with my mother singing in it, and kind of creating this soundscape in the space. And I produced these paintings, which for me were about acknowledging the women and their experiences to try and create a place for them in history. Because I felt like people really didn't know about their experiences or what happened to them. And I felt like information that was written, things that were written really, how do you memorialize what happened to them and create a space for history? And the form of Indian miniature painting here in this instance made perfect sense because it was a form used by royalty or the wealthy to depict their stories. So quite often the stories of those who had power, and they always depicted fair-skinned upper class people or religious stories. So for me, this idea of flipping it and depicting lower caste, brown-skinned women was something really important, and sort of using the style in a different way that left spaces in the work, because of all these I felt like I want to acknowledge these gaps of information that we were having, that I was experiencing and seeing in this colonial archive I was using as reference images and something to respond to. And as part of this as well, I did several performances here with one of my brothers and my mother. This idea of cleansing rituals, because I felt like there was a lot of trauma, and there's a lot of in the indentured communities, or these communities who've sort of been part of this history. So doing these ritual sound performances, I think for me was part of thinking about this other aspect of the story too, community healing and community care as well, being part of the work, not just telling difficult stories, but thinking about descendants and their connections to this history, but also creating safe spaces for them. So I'm going back to this quote I showed again last trimester by Susan Sontag. There is something predatory in the act of taking a picture. To photograph people is to violate them by seeing them as they never see themselves. By having knowledge of them, they can never have it. It turns people into objects that can be symbolically possessed. So I felt like I didn't have enough information, and I was scouring all kinds of places on the internet, in particular eBay, and I started putting in keywords in eBay, and I found this. So this is a glass magic slide, and it's depicting indentured Indians in Natal, South Africa. And so I sort of had this realization that all these people kind of have these for some reason, don't know what they are, but like often in collections in the UK and Europe. And what does that mean in terms of who cares for the archive and what happens and who works with the archive? So I'm going to make this the end of part one, and we'll continue on to the next part.